The moment I realized something was wrong didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, which somehow made it hurt more. I was standing in my living room early one morning, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, when I glanced at the calendar and felt my chest tight. It had been 90 days. 90 days since any of my children had called me, no birthday message, no holiday greeting, not even a quick text asking how I was doing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't part of their routine anymore. The silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional. My name is Elaine. I'm 69 years old, widowed, and I'm telling this story from a place my children don't know I live. That part was a choice. A necessary one. But before I explain why I left and what happened to the house they were already planning to inherit, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? Leave it in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who's lived this. 5 years earlier, my husband, Robert, passed away after 42 years of marriage. He was a careful man, especially with money. When he died, he left me something he'd worked his whole life to provide: stability. A paid-off home worth close to $800,000, a pension, life insurance, and savings meant to last us through old age. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure as long as I was careful. We had 3 children, all adults, all married, all with lives of their own. At least that's what I believed. In the months after Robert's funeral, they surrounded me with attention. My oldest insisted I shouldn't be alone. My daughter offered to help manage my finances so I wouldn't stress. My youngest moved closer, saying he wanted to keep an eye on me. I mistook control for care because grief has a way of blurring warning signs. Then the emergencies started. A business struggling to stay afloat, school expenses that couldn't wait, a medical bill, a car that suddenly became essential. Every request came wrapped in urgency and guilt. Just this once. We'll pay you back. Dad would have helped. So I said yes. Every time. Slowly, without me noticing at first, the tone changed. They stopped asking. They started telling. Amounts were texted. Deadlines included. Gratitude disappeared. And one night, lying awake with my heart racing, I finally asked myself a question that changed everything. When did I stop being their mother and start becoming their bank? Once that question entered my mind, it refused to leave. When did I stop being their mother and start becoming their bank? Every phone call after that felt different. I noticed how conversations never lingered anymore. No one asked how I was sleeping. No one wanted to hear about my day. The calls had a rhythm now: small talk first, urgency second, numbers last, always numbers. I started feeling anxious whenever my phone lit up. Not because I was busy, but because I already knew what was coming. Another crisis. Another temporary problem that somehow always required my money to fix. At first, I told myself this was normal. Families support each other. Parents help their children. I reminded myself that my husband would have done the same. That thought kept me writing checks even when my stomach twisted with unease. But the emergencies never ended. Private school tuition became expected, not appreciated. Business problems turned into regular cash infusions. Renovations were described as necessities, not luxuries. Holidays came with unspoken assumptions about expensive gifts and financial contributions. No one asked if I was comfortable. They just assumed I was. One night, I couldn't sleep. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing. I got out of bed, turned on the lamp, and opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank statements and started adding everything up: every transfer, every check, every short-term loan. The total made my hands shake. Nearly $300,000. Money my husband and I had saved over decades. Money meant to protect me in old age, gone in less than 4 years. The next morning, I called Thomas, our longtime financial advisor. He had worked with my husband for years, and I trusted him. When I showed him the numbers, his expression softened in a way that scared me. He didn't scold me. He didn't judge me. He simply showed me the projections. If I kept going the way I was, I would run out of money in 6 years. 6 years. At 75 years old, I would be broke, no safety net, no independence, no options. You have to stop, he said gently. Your children are adults. They have to solve their own financial problems. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. Knowing he was right didn't make it easier. Saying no to your children, even when they're grown, is one of the hardest things a parent can do. For months, I rehearsed conversations in my head. I lost sleep. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being selfish, cold, ungrateful? Eventually, fear outweighed guilt. I decided to tell them the truth. I called a family meeting. I cooked dinner, set the table nicely, tried to make it feel warm and familiar. Only one of my children arrived on time. Another was late. The third didn't bother coming at all. That should have been my warning. I had prepared for that night the way people prepare for surgery. Carefully, nervously, hoping the pain wouldn't be as bad as I feared. I'd written notes on a small piece of paper, practiced my words in the mirror, reminded myself again and again that I was allowed to protect my future. Still, when the moment came, my hands were shaking. I had cooked a full meal, set the table with the nice dishes, and lit a small candle like we used to do when my husband was alive. I wanted the evening to feel familiar, comforting. I wanted to believe that love would soften what I needed to say. Only my oldest arrived on time. My daughter came almost 40 minutes late, barely apologizing. My youngest didn't come at all. He said he was busy and told me to just put him on speaker. That hurt more than I expected. I started talking anyway. I explained that I'd met with my financial advisor. I mentioned projections, long-term care, the reality of aging. I tried to be calm, kind, reasonable, but halfway through, my rehearsed speech disappeared. "I can't keep giving you money," I said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I can't do it anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, like the air had thickened. My daughter's face hardened. My son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. On the phone, I could hear my youngest inhale sharply. "What do you mean you can't?" my daughter asked. Her voice wasn't confused, it was sharp. Accusing. "I mean exactly that," I said, forcing myself to stay steady. "If I continue, I won't have enough for my own future." My oldest scoffed. "Mom, you have plenty. You live alone in a house worth almost $1 million. You're overreacting." I showed them the papers, the numbers, the truth. My daughter barely glanced at them before pushing them back across the table. "You're letting that advisor scare you. He probably just wants more control over your money." Something inside me snapped. "No," I said, "these numbers are real, and so is my fear." That's when the words came that stopped my heart. "So what?" my youngest said through the phone. "You're just cutting us off after everything we do for you." "Everything you do for me?" I looked at them and realized something devastating. They truly believed I owed them this, that my money belonged to them already. When my daughter finally said it, called me selfish, the room went cold. Selfish. After decades of giving, after every sacrifice. They left without hugging me, without saying goodbye. The call ended abruptly. I sat alone at the table, staring at the untouched food, and cried until there was nothing left. I thought that would be the worst part. I was wrong. For the first few days after that dinner, I told myself everything would settle down. They were upset, defensive, hurt. That was normal, I reasoned. Families fight, especially over money. I was sure they would cool off, call me, and we'd talk like adults. Maybe they'd even understand why I had to draw a line. Days passed. No calls. A week went by, still nothing. When I finally reached out, the conversations were short and hollow. "Can't talk right now. Busy with work. The kids have activities." Their voices sounded distant, like I was an inconvenience they were eager to escape. Then came the exclusions. I wasn't invited to my grandson's birthday party. That one nearly broke me. I had been at every birthday since he was born. I sent a gift anyway, a toy he'd been asking for. It was delivered. It was opened. And it was never acknowledged. No thank you, no message, nothing. Thanksgiving arrived next. For more than 40 years, I had hosted Thanksgiving in my home. I cooked for days. It was tradition. That year, no one mentioned plans. When I finally called my daughter, she sounded surprised to hear from me. "Oh," she said casually, "we're doing Thanksgiving at your brother's this year." There was a pause before I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Am I invited?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. "Things are still tense. Maybe some space would help." Space, that's what they called it. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in my life, eating leftovers and watching old movies, trying not to imagine my children and grandchildren laughing together without me. Christmas was worse. I sent gifts for all the grandchildren. Carefully chosen, lovingly wrapped, I even included checks for my children, much smaller than before, but still generous. I thought maybe it would soften things, show them I wasn't abandoning them. The checks were cashed within days. The silence remained. That's when the truth finally settled in. They weren't angry because I had hurt them. They were angry because I had stopped providing. Once the money was gone, so was my place in their lives. I stopped sleeping, lost weight, avoided friends because I couldn't bear the questions about my family. The house felt like a museum filled with memories of people who no longer wanted me. I kept telling myself it couldn't get worse. I was wrong. Because a few months later, I overheard something that changed everything and erased the last bit of guilt I had left. It was an ordinary weekday afternoon, the kind that blends into every other quiet day when you live alone. I had gone to the grocery store to pick up a few things, moving slowly through the aisles, lost in my own thoughts. I wasn't expecting anything to happen. I certainly wasn't expecting my life to shift in the middle of a store. That's when I saw her, my daughter-in-law. My first instinct was relief, a familiar face, a connection to my family. I almost called her name, desperate for any small thread back to them, but something made me stop. She was on her phone, standing just a few feet away, and her voice carried clearly down the aisle. She laughed. "I know," she said. "She really thought we'd keep showing up after she cut us off." I froze. Another laugh, louder this time. Cruel. "We're just waiting it out," she continued. "She's old. Eventually, she'll pass and the house will be ours anyway. Why pretend until then?" I stood there, gripping my shopping basket, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't hiding it. She was speaking casually, like she was discussing a delayed package or an inconvenient appointment. They weren't missing me. They were waiting for me to die, not because they loved me, not because they wanted me remembered, but because my death was a financial event they were anticipating. I don't remember putting the basket down, but suddenly my hands were empty. I don't remember walking out, but moments later I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, staring straight ahead. And for the first time in months, I didn't cry. The grief that had been weighing me down evaporated, replaced by something cold and sharp. Clarity, everything made sense. The sudden silence, the fake apologies, the cashing of checks without thank yous. I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was an obstacle between them and what they wanted. I drove home in silence and sat in my living room, surrounded by family photos that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I looked at the walls, the furniture, the house they were already mentally dividing among themselves. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit around waiting to be erased. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life shrinking myself so others could benefit. I picked up my phone and called my financial advisor. "I want to sell the house," I said, quietly, "and I don't want my children to know until it's done." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he asked, "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied, because I finally understood something powerful. If they were waiting for my death, I would give them something else instead. My disappearance. Once the decision was made, everything became strangely calm. The fear that had lived in my chest for months disappeared, replaced by focus. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was acting, and that made all the difference. My financial advisor connected me with a real estate agent he trusted, someone discreet and efficient. I made one thing clear from the beginning. My children could not know. No signs, no neighborhood gossip, no loose ends. This wasn't about revenge, it was about freedom. The house went on the market quietly. Professional photos were taken while I stayed with a friend for the afternoon. Every room looked polished and warm, like a home filled with love. I almost laughed at the irony. Within days, offers started coming in. Strong ones, higher than expected. I accepted an offer from a young couple expecting their first child. That part mattered to me. They walked through the house with wonder in their eyes, talking about nurseries and backyard memories they hadn't even lived yet. I hoped, truly hoped, that the walls would hear laughter again. Real laughter, not entitlement. The closing date was set for 6 weeks later. During those weeks, I planned my exit with precision. I researched places I'd always dreamed of living, quiet towns, lower costs of living, places where no one knew my history. I chose a small mountain city I had visited once decades ago and never forgot. Peaceful, slower, mine. I found a modest condo with a view of the mountains and bought it outright. No mortgage, no strings. Then came the packing. I worked slowly, one room at a time, deciding what would follow me into my new life and what belonged to the past. I kept only what I truly loved: clothes, books, a favorite chair, and one photo album. Just one. The rest, the furniture, the decorations, decades of accumulated things, I donated or left behind, including boxes of family photos. Let the new owners wonder who we were. Let them imagine a happy family. As the closing date approached, I felt lighter each day. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like an anchor I was finally lifting. The morning of the closing, I signed the paperwork without hesitation. The check represented not just money, but decades of work, sacrifice, and survival. And for the first time, it belonged entirely to me. That afternoon, I drove away. No goodbye tour, no backward glance, just forward motion. What I didn't know yet was that my children had started to sense something was wrong, and they were about to come running. 3 weeks before the sale was finalized, my phone rang. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. My daughter's name glowed back at me, cheerful and familiar, like nothing had ever happened. It was the first time she'd called in months. Her voice was warm, too warm. "Mom, I was just thinking about you," she said brightly. "How have you been?" I almost laughed at how rehearsed it sounded. "I'm fine," I replied carefully. "How are the kids?" "Oh, they're great," she said quickly. Then, without missing a beat, "Listen, I've been thinking, I think we all overreacted before. Family matters more than money, don't you think?" The timing wasn't subtle. She invited me to dinner that Sunday. "Everyone will be there," she said. "It's time we put this behind us." I knew exactly what had happened. Someone had seen the house. A neighbor, a listing, a whisper that traveled faster than honesty ever did. They were panicking. I agreed to dinner. On Sunday afternoon, I set my phone on the table and watched the minutes pass. At 4:45, I sent a short message to the family group chat. "Not feeling well, need to cancel. Hope you all have a nice evening." Then I turned my phone off. I imagined them checking their watches, calling, growing frustrated, the same way I had waited for them on holidays and birthdays. For the first time, I felt nothing. No guilt. No sadness, just distance. The closing happened 2 weeks later on a quiet Tuesday morning. I signed the final papers, accepted the check, and walked out free. That afternoon, I arrived at my new home, small, clean, and overlooking the mountains. Everything I owned fit comfortably inside. Before leaving the old house, I had left something behind. A letter, not angry, not cruel, honest. In it, I explained why I sold the house, why I was leaving, why I would no longer be part of their lives. I told them I had heard the conversation. I told them the inheritance they were waiting for no longer existed. And then I mailed copies of that letter to each of their homes, timed to arrive the day after the sale. My phone exploded that night. Calls, voicemails, accusations, rage. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I blocked their numbers and sat on my balcony, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, breathing freely for the first time in years. But they weren't done yet. They had one final move left. The next morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Not one of those polite, carefully folded letters. It was thick, official-looking, stamped with a law firm's logo. My heart skipped, but not with fear, with anticipation. I opened it slowly. They were suing me, alleging everything from unjust enrichment to emotional abandonment. They wanted the house back. They wanted the money they thought they were owed. They wanted me to explain myself in court. I read the words twice. And then, for the first time in decades, I laughed, because I had already won. I had won not by fighting, not by pleading, and not by justifying myself. I had won by living my truth, by putting boundaries around my life and refusing to let guilt and manipulation dictate my days. I called my lawyer. We filed the necessary paperwork. The suit dragged on for months, but it never had a real chance. I had kept meticulous records, every text, every transfer, every request disguised as need. I had documented every attempt they made to guilt me, every lie wrapped in urgency. By the time the court dismissed the case, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about respect, and I had claimed it for myself. More importantly, I reclaimed my life. I filled my days with quiet joys. Mornings on the balcony with my coffee, afternoons hiking the trails I'd always admired from afar. evenings lost in books I never had time to read. I discovered music I hadn't heard since college, painted small canvases of the mountains outside my window, and even started a small garden on the patio. No one called, no one asked for updates, and honestly, I didn't care. The silence that once felt like a wound became a kind of freedom, a space where I could finally hear myself again. Months later, I received one final text, not from them, but from a neighbor I had confided in during the move. "They're still talking about you. They don't understand. They can't." And I smiled because I did understand. I understood that love isn't supposed to feel like a transaction. That family isn't measured in what you give or get back. That self-respect isn't negotiable. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their calls. I didn't need their inheritance. I had myself, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The silence remained, but now it was mine, and it spoke louder than any argument, any plea, any guilt ever could.